Up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Claff. The Orioles are going to the playoffs. We were on this podcast last week and the vibes weren't awesome. The vibes are much better today as we wake up and the Orioles clinched a playoff berth in New York last night. The boys might be back. We might be back.
The vibes are definitely better than last week. I feel like it's just a huge sigh of relief after the second half that the Orioles have had, and to kind of make that comeback from the first half going super well in May and June, and then obviously end of June into July and up until now has not been the ideal season and second half, of course, but this is just what the O's needed, a sigh of relief, a break, not necessarily an actual break, but it'll let them kind of cool down a little bit before the postseason begins.
Yeah, you get an important win in New York. The team that is more than likely going to win the AL East, their magic number is just 1 in the division, but that's an important win in New York. Dean Kramer looked good once again, which gives you a lot of confidence going into the playoffs. We're going to talk about Grayson Rodriguez update here in a minute. That gives you some confidence. I mean, the Yankees had Clark Schmidt on the mound, who had a solid season thus far. It's got just a 2.55 ERA after last night's game. You're able to put up some runs on the board against him. You get some runs on the board against the Yankees bullpen as well. Always nice to beat a division rival, especially one that you might see in the playoffs in a few weeks. And then you clinch and you have fun, and the clubhouse looks like they're vibing in together. We heard a lot about the underscore for Daisy in The Great Gatsby. So the vibes felt like they were back. And I know it's just one win, but it was a very important win, obviously for the significance of it, but also just because, again, you're beating the Yankees in a solid, close game. You had good pitching. You had good defense. The offense did enough. It felt like a complete Orioles win. Yeah,
and it was a great night, and it was good to see all those guys having a good time because they've been through a lot this season. I don't think any other team has kind of withheld this much injury and trying to play the next man up mentality, and they've succeeded so far.
Yeah.
Passed with flying colors since then. I mean, you look at what the starting rotation was supposed to be going into the season to now, it's completely different. But hey, it's working so far. I mean, pitching has been one of the strongest suits for this team in September, really.
Yeah.
Given the Orioles offense slumping a little bit here and there. So definitely a good thing to keep in mind that the O's really deserve this after everything that they've gone through and have done so well.
Yeah, and they do technically still have a chance to win the division.
Oh, yeah.
They would have to win each of their next 5, and the Yankees would have to lose each of their next 5. It's not completely off the table. I wouldn't exactly say that it's front and center sitting on the table, but it's kind of vaguely off to the corner on the table. Maybe taped underneath. Yeah, it's table adjacent, I would say, is probably a better descriptor for it. We've got plenty of more playoff stuff to talk about, and we will get to all of the good, happy news here in a minute. But we do have some other news that we should go over. First and foremost is the news that Grayson Rodriguez did not travel with the team to New York and has not yet faced live hitters. It's not great. Time is not on their side to get Grayson Rodriguez back in this starting rotation. We really hoped that we would be able to see him in the playoff rotation, because when you look at the Orioles' top 3 in their pitching staff, a Corbin Burnes, Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez 3-man rotation with probably Dean Kramer as your number 4, has you feeling pretty good in a 7-game series. Now, more likely than not, they are going to be in a wild card series, and I think realistically you can get out of that series with a win from Corbin Burnes and a win from Zach Eflin. Still a really solid number 1 and number 2. As mentioned, Dean Kramer has looked excellent lately. I think you're feeling better and better about him as a number 3 starter in the playoffs. But obviously the upside of Grayson Rodriguez will be missed. And I'm not saying he is 100% out for the playoffs. The Orioles have not ruled him out. But the things we know to be true are that he hasn't faced live hitters yet. And so he would have to go through sim games to get back up to speed, because there is no AAA Norfolk season for him to go back to and rehab at this point. It would be a really quick turnaround to get him ramped up, even if it is simulated games, to get him to even an 80 pitch workload for a game. I guess a bullpen role is a possibility. I would be surprised if the Orioles do that, because what we got from Mike Elias was that as much as they would like to have Grayson Rodriguez in this starting rotation for the playoffs, he is one of their most talented pitchers. He is an important piece in this rotation. The priority is Grayson Rodriguez's long-term health, because the goal is that he is a quality starting pitcher on this team for a really long time. So they're not going to push him to ramp up the workload really, really quickly to get him back in the starting rotation if it's going to jeopardize his long-term health.
Yeah, and I was going to say that we mentioned this briefly last week, but Mike Elias was asked that same question of, okay, could we see Rodriguez in the bullpen for the postseason? And he was like, I mean, we're not ruling it out, but this guy is a starting pitcher, and we're not going to jeopardize that, like you mentioned. So I do think that is a little bit unlikely, and given kind of obviously Norfolk's season is over, and that was kind of running against the clock as well. So you are missing that opportunity and time for Grayson to have that experience against live hitters, especially, I mean, if you do feel comfortable enough just throwing him in there after simulated experience, I don't know if you do, and especially when you have Dean Kramer, who has been performing super well lately, and we saw last night he did really well. I think you do probably feel more comfortable throwing Kramer into that situation, regardless of how he did in the postseason last year, knowing that he's had a strong September, as opposed to Grayson Rodriguez, who has not faced any live hitters in the whole month of September and longer than that. And then also with Albert Suarez, he's kind of a toss-up, too, to fill him in that number 3 spot. He's had a few iffy starts here and there, but he's still a phenomenal starter, and he's arguably one of the team's most valuable players this season. So to see him either in that number 3 spot or the bullpen, which we know he's lights out in anyways, can be great too.
Yeah, absolutely. You have flexibility there. I wouldn't be surprised to see Cade Povich find his way onto this playoff roster somewhere, even if more than likely it is not as a starter. That's a tough scenario to put a rookie in the playoffs, and it would be a tough scenario for Grayson Rodriguez to come back cold and say, hey, your first game back, game 3, do or die wild card series. That's a tough spot for Grayson. So I would be pleasantly surprised if we see Grayson Rodriguez on a wild card roster at this point. I think it's more likely, and what you could be hoping for is if the Orioles advance to the ALDS and you're looking at a 7-game series, that's when Grayson Rodriguez becomes even more necessary than a wild card round where you could toss Burns and Eflin and hopefully get out of that series in 2 games with those 2 guys potentially being lights out as they have been for the last stretch here. So among kind of a whirlwind of really good injury updates for the Orioles and getting guys back in guys that we're going to talk about here in a bit, Grayson Rodriguez is really the only one that it's like, I wish we had some more good news about him. But the Orioles have gotten pretty overwhelmingly good news with the other guys that we're going to talk about in a little bit here. But first, we do need to talk about some news that happened right after the podcast last week, as it often does. We get done with our podcast at noon, and news breaks at about 2 o'clock. That was the Orioles DFAing Craig Kimbrel. Last Wednesday after the podcast, Brian Baker recalled he was released yesterday, so he will not be staying in the organization. Signed a 1-year, $13 million deal at winter meetings last year, had an option for 2025. Just really didn't work out for Craig Kimbrel. It was a great first half of the season. It was 39 games, a 2.80 ERA, 13.5 Ks per 9, a whip under 1,000. That was exactly what you paid for in Kimbrel. You weren't looking for the prime Craig Kimbrel that was one of the best closers, if not the best closer in the game when he was in Atlanta and he was in Boston. You were looking for a stopgap to get you to when Felix Bautista was back in this bullpen. And in the first half of the year, it looked like that was what Kimbrel was doing. He had some rough patches here and there. Brandon Hyde was able to take him out, give him a little bit of rest, put him in the 6th, 7th inning in lower leverage situations, got him back on track. In the second half of the season, it just didn't really work that way. We were expecting the ebbs and flows. We talked about it in the offseason. When this signing was made, that's what he did last year in Philadelphia. It was, okay, he was great in July, and then he had a tough August, but then he was great in September, and then he was bad in the bullpen. This was just a case where Craig Kimbrel, for whatever reason, whatever adjustments the Orioles were trying to make in the second half, he just couldn't find it. The juice wasn't there. The command wasn't there. You worked through the ebbs and flows in the first half of the season, and it led to a borderline all-star first half from Craig Kimbrel. We said that he kind of got snubbed. There were many around the league who thought that he got snubbed from that all-star nod, but he just really wasn't able to get back on track here in the second half.
Yeah, and you mentioned the ebbs and flows, and I think that is something you could have expected, some inconsistencies from Craig Kimbrel. He did have a really good first half of the season, minus kind of those few flukes in a row, but then obviously came back from that, and that's what we were expecting after that one spurt of time, and then it got later into the season. We're like, okay, it's just going to be the same exact thing as before. He'll come back from that. I don't think anyone could have predicted his second half to be so jarringly different from the first half.
Yeah.
I mean, an ERA just under 11 since the All-Star break is not the Craig Kimbrel that people were expecting, and not the one, obviously, that you would have hoped for as you go into the postseason, especially because he's had some pasts where you get later into the season, but that's more so October. Would not expect a September like that out of Kimbrel. So, and it is kind of sad knowing that, okay, he had 6 earned runs in only 2/3 of an inning in his last time as an Oriole. And that's just kind of a sad thing. Like, I feel like my heart goes out to him because I know that that's not the way you want to walk off the field.
Yeah, and it was a tough spot for Kimbrel because part of the excitement in getting him in this year, of course you wanted the production on the field, but it was also just cool to have, like, this was a Hall of Fame caliber closer. He is on that track. You were getting to watch him climb up the save leaderboards. We got to see it at Camden Yards where he was breaking records. He was moving up the leaderboard. You were watching a guy, yes, at the tail end of his career, but he was just kind of checking boxes off of this historical checklist with trying to get to the Hall of Fame as one of the better closers in the game. And he has been for the last 10 plus years. And so to see him just not be able to figure it out so consistently in the second half, you're right. Like, it's genuinely a bummer because Kimbrel has been one of the best closers in baseball for a really long time, and it just didn't work this year. 57 games, a 5.33 ERA, still struck out 12.5 batters per 9 innings, walked over 5. The whip ballooned to up over 1,300. In seasons where he had 50-plus games, it was his highest ERA by a wide margin, walks per 9, hits per 9. They just couldn't get him back on track in the second half. James McCann talked about it in the Orioles clubhouse. You were seeing him trying different things. You were trying to get him back in the groove, and he just wasn't there. And it was a bit of a catch-22 towards the end of the year because Kimbrel is the type of pitcher that thrives as a closer. There's just something different about the ninth inning, and some pitchers have it and some pitchers don't. Craig Kimbrel, for really the entirety of his career, has just been a guy who has had it, and he very clearly thrives in the ninth inning. That is what Kimbrel is made for. Go out in the ninth inning, pressure's high, he's going to get it done. And so it was this weird catch-22 where you know that Kimbrel is probably at his best in those kinds of scenarios in the ninth inning where it's crunch time and you need somebody and he just kind of has that juice, but you couldn't trust him in that role down the stretch. So you turned to guys like Sir Anthony Dominguez and Yennier Cano and kind of played the matchups a little bit. So Kimbrel is now taken out of that ninth inning role. He's no longer going after save records. He's not in the same high leverage spot that he really thrives under. So, yes, he may not have been in the position where he really likes to pitch, but you also couldn't trust him in that position because he was getting hit a lot in the ninth inning. So there really didn't feel like a way to get the mojo back for Kimbrel because if you couldn't trust him in the ninth inning, you weren't going to pitch him there. But if he wasn't pitching in the ninth inning, then he wasn't really Craig Kimbrel.
Yeah, and I think it's a tough pill to swallow just knowing the kind of roller coaster of a season that he's had and kind of a very steady decline since the beginning or since the All-Star break. But you do think that the Orioles, it's probably the right decision given he probably wasn't going to be on the wild card roster anyways. So instead of just prolonging him until opening him up into free agency in the off season. But what you do have to look at now is an Orioles bullpen who does not necessarily have a designated closer, and that's something that's the Orioles have been trying to maneuver and battle this entire season, really.
Yeah.
But one thing that we noticed last night is they played 6 relievers across 4 innings, and it worked out very well, aside from 2 earned runs from Cionel Perez. But you didn't even use Danny Coulombe last night, so that's also a good sign, because look at how deep this bullpen is right now, and something that you can trust Brandon Hyde to kind of make those calls for what you do with the bullpen in a very similar situation to what we could see in the division series.
Yeah, Brandon Hyde has been managing this team like it's a playoff game for the last week plus. We saw it against Detroit. We saw it last night in New York. There are a lot of relievers on this team right now that I trust in a 7th, 8th, 9th inning scenario that feels important. And I think we saw a lot of them last night. You mentioned the guys who pitched. It was Keegan Aiken, Jacob Webb, Cionel Perez, Yennier Cano, Gregory Soto, Sir Anthony Dominguez. I would throw Danny Coulombe into that conversation as well in terms of guys that I really trust in a high leverage spot. It's a lot of dudes. Yeah. I mean, Keegan Aiken is probably going to get a 5th, 6th inning rather than an 8th, 9th inning. I think Cionel Perez, having allowed a few runs over his last few outings, maybe he gets a 6th, 7th inning, but guys like Webb, Cano, Soto, Dominguez, Coulombe, I wouldn't be surprised if it is just kind of a closer by committee. I think Sir Anthony Dominguez, if you are looking at a leader in the clubhouse, he's probably the one guy that I would point to say, okay, if all things are equal, he probably gets a save opportunity here. But if it's a 9th inning and there's 2 lefties coming up out of the 3 guys you're facing, I think you could throw Gregory Soto. I think you could throw Danny Coulombe in that spot. I think it's going to be very matchup dependent. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a 9th inning where we see Sir Anthony get 2/3 of an inning and then Gregory Soto. I think they can mix and match very, very well. So while there's not one guy, there's not a Felix Bautista on this roster right now, I feel pretty comfortable with the high leverage relievers that the Orioles have. I think there's a lot of good options.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that, again, we have just said it a few times, but even not having Danny Coulombe in last night and still seeing the way that they covered those last 4 innings without Coulombe, and you're super glad to have him back, because he's one of those guys that when you went on the injured list, you're like, oh my gosh, okay.
Yep.
We really hope that he'll be back for September in this postseason push, and you do have him now. He's only had a few outings in the big leagues since then, so it'll be great to have him kind of thrown into that situation as well. Likely, again, not a closer situation, but I think that you're right. I would feel comfortable with all of those guys in the postseason.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Danny Coulombe in terms of our thinking with, wow, I really hope he's able to come back here in late September. All things considered, I know we talked about Grayson Rodriguez and the fact that time is not on the Orioles' side with getting him back in the starting rotation for the playoffs. All things considered, on the injury front, I think the Orioles have to feel pretty good about the guys that they have been able to get back in late September, because Danny Coulombe is back in the bullpen. Jacob Webb is back in the bullpen. Those are both recent developments over the last few weeks. And in the lineup, you got Jordan Westburg, you got Ramón Urías, you got Ryan Mountcastle.
Big 3.
The boys are back. Jordan Westburg came back and immediately delivered a huge RBI double against the Tigers, because that's what Jordan Westburg does. We have talked about it for months now, that you were missing probably your most clutch hitter, the guy who is going to come up and deliver in most big spots with runners in scoring position. That's what Jordan Westburg does. You got Ryan Mountcastle, who wasn't back in the lineup yesterday, but he came in to pinch hit for Ryan O'Hearn, had a 109-mile-an-hour single up the middle. This lineup feels like the Orioles lineup a little bit more, and that is nothing against guys like Livan Soto and Emmanuel Rivera. They played admirably in the absence of guys like Westburg and Urías and Mountcastle. But you look at the lineup card right now, and you go 1 through 9, and it feels like a really big difference when you look at the 6, 7, 8, 9 hitters in the lineup. And rather than that lineup card being filled, again, nothing against Livan Soto and Emmanuel Rivera. They did a really nice job
carried for
filling in.
Significant
yeah,
portion.
Emmanuel Rivera had some clutch at-bats. Livan Soto, there was the one game where you basically looked at it and you were like, wow, Livan Soto kind of saved us in this one. Those guys performed well. Eloy Jimenez had his moments. But you look at the bottom of the lineup now, and it's Mullins, Cowser, Mountcastle, Urías, guys like that, and you just feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
You just feel a little bit better.
It feels like the beginning of the season. And
yeah.
I think that regardless of how much the O's struggled in the beginning of September into middle and late September, you kind of look at it, okay, so if you had gotten Westburg, Urías, and Mountcastle back in the beginning of September, which is kind of what we had hoped for ever since their injuries even occurred, we're like, okay, as long as we have them by September, having that September push, I would argue that a push now towards the very end of September into the postseason is a heck of a lot better than having them at the beginning of September and then it leaves some room to slump before playoffs even begin.
Yeah.
So you have them for this late September push into the playoffs, and I think that that's huge to have the three of them. I mean, we haven't seen the three of them on the field together since July 30th. That's a huge gap to be missing those three huge key pieces in this infield, both on offense and defense.
And we talked about this last week in terms of the offensive struggles, but having Mountcastle, Urías, Westburg back, those are consistent pieces that you want to get in the lineup pretty often, and it allows for other guys to settle back into their roles. Jordan Westburg is going to play every day against left-handers, against right-handers. He's an all-star third baseman for a reason. He might play third base, he might play second base. Having him and Ramón Urías back allows you to, A, not have to start Emmanuel Rivera as consistently as you were before, and I think Rivera can be a nice pinch hitter. He can be a nice situational guy if he ends up making this roster down the stretch. I'd be a little bit surprised if he's on the playoff roster, but we'll see. But it allows you to move a guy like Jackson Holliday back into a role where he can just mash against right-handed pitching, starting at second base. Throwing Jackson Holliday, as good of a prospect as he is, as great of a player as he is more than likely going to turn out to be, throwing Jackson Holliday into the fire in the middle of a playoff push, starting every day at second base, down Jorge Mateo, down Ramón Urías, and down Jordan Westburg, was a really, really tough spot for Jackson Holliday to be in. I don't care that he's the number one prospect in baseball. That's tough for any 20-year-old player to come in and try to do. But if you can have Jackson Holliday start at second base against right-handed pitching, okay, that feels like a more suitable role for him at this point. Same goes for Ryan O'Hearn. Ryan O'Hearn has really thrived in Baltimore because of some swing changes, some mechanical things that he has worked on with the Orioles hitting coaches, but also because the Orioles have put him in a position to succeed, which was starting against right-handed pitching and just absolutely mashing. When you didn't have Ryan Mountcastle, you couldn't start Ryan O'Hearn just in those spots. You had to start him against left-handed pitching as well. And I know his numbers went down against right-handed pitching a little bit too in September and August. That's because he was playing pretty much every day. And that's not what you needed from Ryan O'Hearn for a really long stretch of time. Now he can just go back to being your DH against right-handed pitching, your first baseman against right-handed pitching, with Mountcastle, with Rutschman in the lineup as well. Guys can settle back into their roles where they were thriving. And yes, it's the same players, but those players are going to succeed more when they are put in the correct positions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a huge topic of conversation that we brought up last week when the vibes were significantly lower than they are right now was that these guys are getting stretched way further out than they had to be in the beginning of the season and are used to being. Like you said, we had Ryan O'Hearn playing against lefties and righty pitchers. And we also, when in a different situation before Ryan Mountcastle got injured, that wouldn't be the case. And when Ryan O'Hearn had been thriving against righty pitchers instead of both. So you have that kind of difference now when you have players that can take a back seat, take a rest against in situations where they wouldn't have been put in beforehand, before all these injuries. And you do have that depth, but it was getting to a point when the offensive slump was happening at peak level, was that these guys were really getting forced out of their comfort zones a little bit and too much. I mean, we'll also see kind of some interesting lineup arrangements with Ryan Mountcastle, Heston Kjerstad in the lineup. So I would bet that either or will be in the lineup, not all of them, given all the right-handers that are back now. So that'll be interesting, but I do trust Hyde to make those lineups and play the matchup as well.
Yeah, and it allows Brandon Hyde to manage this team like a playoff team, which, again, he has been doing that with the bullpen over the last week or so, but he can manage the lineup like that now.
Yeah.
Because you're so much deeper than you were before with the addition of Mountcastle and Urías and Westburg. Yes, you had guys. Eloy Jimenez was one on the bench, right? He gets optioned and accepted an option to AAA Norfolk. He is a free agent next year. Would that be nice to see him in the organization? Not sure if the Orioles will bring him back, but yeah, hey, if he liked it here and it was a good change of scenery, who knows? You had guys like Jimenez on the bench, but they weren't the same kind of pinch hit options that you have right now. And you can move the guys that were having to start back into pinch hit defensive replacement roles. Austin Slater is a great example. Right-handed hitting outfielder. Not 100% sure if he is going to be on the playoff roster or not because you have Colton Cowser, Heston Kjerstad, Cedric Mullins, Anthony Santander that I think are the 4 outfield locks for the playoff roster. But having Austin Slater on the bench as a solid platoon bat against left-handed pitching, I know the numbers have been a little bit down this year against lefties, but over the course of his career, he has been great against lefties. He's a solid defensive replacement in a corner outfield. He's probably a better defender at this point than somebody like Heston Kjerstad. Anthony Santander has stepped up defensively this year, but Slater is still a good option there.
Sure.
Having him off the bench is really nice. Having Mountcastle, Kjerstad off the bench if they aren't starting on any given day. Mountcastle and Kjerstad as your pinch hit options versus a Rivera and Soto, it makes your lineup feel a lot deeper, and you can make substitutions and switches earlier on in the game and not feel like you're stuck somewhere. If Ryan Mountcastle pinch hits for Ryan O'Hearn in the 6th inning of a game, even if there's a right-handed bullpen arm that comes up later, you don't feel stuck with Ryan Mountcastle against a right-handed pitcher. It's still Ryan Mountcastle. You can make those sort of switches earlier in the game because this lineup is so much deeper now with these guys returning that Brandon Hyde has the freedom to manage it like a playoff team because it has the playoff talent back.
Yeah, and let's not forget that this is the best pinch hitting team in the big leagues. So and that was even when Brandon Hyde was trying to use the players that he even had because these guys were on the injured list. So he was using Emmanuel Rivera and Livon Soto.
Are you telling me Brandon Hyde was doing things well?
Oh, I'm telling you that
can't
he was
be right.
doing them very
The internet
well.
told me different. That can't be right.
But if he was able to pinch hit that or to manage these pinch hitters that way with a team that was struggling with depth, imagine how it's going to be in the postseason when he has all these players back. I mean, you feel a lot better having Jackson Holliday knowing that he's a 20-year-old going into this postseason, his first postseason experience, that you're not starting him, but he's still the same player, and it's the same plate approach that he's going to have as a pinch hitter when you know that you need someone in that situation.
Yeah.
Not necessarily stretching him out so thin to start in the lineup against a lefty pitcher.
Yeah, Jackson Holliday off the bench is a really, really, really nice piece off the bench. As I said, it's great to have the best prospect in baseball come up and be an injury replacement for somebody like Jorge Mateo. It's even better when you can fit him into a role that makes sense, that's not absolutely throwing him into the fire when the Orioles are trying to make a playoff push. So having Jackson Holliday in the clubhouse, getting this experience, that's great. I'm glad Kobe Mayo got some reps as well. That was obviously you don't want any of those guys to go down. It was nice to see Kobe Mayo come up and get some reps. Yeah, he struggled. May I point you to Colton Cowser last year, who is now one of, if not the favorites to win American League Rookie of the Year. It's pretty much him and Austin Wells in New York. So Colton Cowser struggled last year, came back this year, was great. I expect the same thing from Kobe Mayo.
Me too.
And he gets the experience of being a part of this team for a September push. But the vibes are back. The boys are back. It feels like a turning point. It feels like a new season.
It does.
Because this team is so much deeper than
the
they
trade
have been
deadline
for the
that
last.
we've been talking about.
It happened.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny
overnight.
that we have spent so long talking about, well, when this guy gets back and when this guy gets back and when this guy gets back, things are going to turn around. Things are going to feel better. And no, things haven't 100% completely turned around. They still lost the series against Detroit. We're one game into this series in New York, all of the problems aren't magically fixed, but you feel a lot better with 5 good players back on this team that you didn't have a few weeks ago. So I don't know if everything's going to magically turn around, but you see the vibe in the clubhouse last night after the Orioles clinch a playoff berth. You just see the way they're playing on the field in the short sample size that we have with these guys back, and it feels like the Orioles from the first half of the season. I don't know if everything's fixed, but it feels better right now.
Yeah, and the next priority at hand is solidifying that top wild card spot, which is still a magic number of 2. So if they win tonight and the Tigers lose tonight as well, then they get that top wild card spot, which means home field advantage. But you're also, and that's definitely likely, but you've seen the O's on the road, and they're still very successful on the road. I mean, 43-33 on the road this year. And I kind of like seeing the Orioles bat first, because when they get on the board first, they tend to have a good night. So I think that you wouldn't be too upset if you do see them on the road regardless throughout the postseason. And even with last year, they clinched the top spot in the division. So then they had a bye from the wild card series, and then they got straight into the division series, and that didn't go so well. So I feel like right now, yes, it's out of reach to win the division, but I feel like that's fine, because I kind of like the momentum that the O's have right now. Keep it rolling. Don't take a bye. Keep the wild card series, win that, and then move on to the next round and have that same momentum that they have right now.
Yeah, the Orioles, it remains to be seen whether or not teams benefit or do not benefit from having that time off before the ALDS, because with the current playoff format, the top 2 seeds do not have to play in the wild card round and wait for the ALDS. That did not go well for the top 2 seeds in either the American League or the National League last year. There's not a large enough sample size, like I said, to say whether or not that really makes a difference. I don't know if the teams loved the time off last year. So, sure, the Orioles without some time off, they are getting the guys back, get some momentum going. Yeah, let's talk playoff scenarios, because now the Orioles are in the playoffs. Even before that, I just want to say, too, making the playoffs 2 years in a row is really hard. I know that this team had really high expectations, and I understand if you have looked at the last 3 months and looked at a baseball team that didn't feel like a playoff contender that was going to make a deep run. I understand all of those feelings, but making the playoffs 2 years in a row is an accomplishment that should not get underplayed, because the Orioles have not made the playoffs twice in a row since 96 and 97. It has been a while since the Orioles did that. Even when they were consistently a good team in the mid-2010s, they didn't make the playoffs in back-to-back years. With that classic 2010s team that you remember with, Buck Showalter and Adam Jones and JJ, all those guys did not make the playoffs in back-to-back seasons. And the Orioles just did that this year. They are still pretty fresh off of this rebuild. And for as many struggles as they have had, Brandon Hyde and Mike Elias and company found a way to get this injury-depleted roster to make the playoffs once again in 2024. And we should not undersell that, because that is a really hard thing to do. They have the 3rd best record in the American League still. I know it hasn't really felt that way, and I know it's been a tough season, it feels like, all around for baseball without a team that's going to win 100-plus games. But even look at last year. The Rangers won the World Series. They're not making the playoffs. The Blue Jays and the Rays both had disappointing seasons. They were in the playoffs last year. They're not making it this year. The Twins made the playoffs last year. They are on the fringe right now. They are a game back of the final wild card spot. So it could really just be the Orioles and the Astros that are back-to-back playoff teams from last year and this year if the Twins don't end up making the playoffs. It's hard to do, and the Orioles did it.
Yeah, and especially when you look at the whole season that they've had, the injuries, the slumps, everything, it just really feels like that this is the momentum that they need, and that you are, regardless of everything that's happened this season, you're super proud that the Orioles have done that, because not every single team has that grit and kind of depth to be able to do that. So it's really impressive what they've done so far. Hopefully they get a sigh of relief right now, but it's not over yet. Maybe if they clinch that top wild card spot, those will be kind of their break, their bye a little bit, because those remaining games wouldn't necessarily matter as much. You wouldn't have anything to play for until the next round, the wild card series began. So definitely a round of applause for those.
Yeah, and there are benefits to it, right? If they do end up clinching the top wild card spot with a few games remaining, you can make sure that Corbin Burnes is on the correct amount of rest before game 1 of a wild card series. Same goes for Zach Eflin with game 2. You can make sure that all of your bullpen arms are fresh. If there's anybody that's feeling a little banged up, I mean, you can rest those guys going into the playoffs. They still have things to play for, and I don't think the Orioles are going to just send out punt lineups 3 games in a row if they clinch the top wild card spot. But you can manage it in a smart way. You don't want to completely lose your momentum. It's not You're not going to want to lose 3 straight games going into the wild card series and feel terrible about how the team is playing, but you can manage it in a smart way where you have all of your high leverage bullpen arms ready to go. You have your starting pitching ready to go. The position players are all healthy and set, so you can manage it in a smart way. Because as of right now, as mentioned, the division, the Yankees aren't going to lose every single game for the rest of the year. The Orioles aren't going to win every single game for the rest of the year. Could happen.
That'd be kind of a leap, though.
It would be kind of a leap. But you never know. You never know, but we kind of know, right? The Orioles are probably going to be a wild card team. And they are 4 games up on the Tigers and Royals. And as you mentioned, their magic number, not a large one. So more than likely, the Orioles will be the top wild card spot, which means they will play the second best wild card team. Right now, that is looking like either the Tigers or the Royals. The Twins are 2 games back of the final wild card spot. The Mariners are technically still in it as well. They are 2.5 games back. I would be surprised if the final 2 wild card teams are not the Tigers and the Royals. Whoever finishes in the 3rd wild card spot between those 2 will more than likely have to play the Houston Astros in round 1, and the other one would be left for the Orioles. You're going to have to beat good teams in the playoffs. And I think on paper, at least how I view it, I think the Orioles are a more talented team than the Tigers by a pretty significant stretch. Yeah. And I think they are a more talented team on paper than the Royals as well. The Tigers are just the hottest team in baseball in the second half, and you never want to see a team like that in the playoffs. But the Orioles played them really tough here at Camden Yards. Those were close, competitive playoff type of games. Both teams managed it like that because the Tigers have been fighting for their lives, and the Orioles have been trying to break out of this slump and we're trying to clinch a playoff spot as well. You're a few spectacular plays from the Tigers defense away from the Orioles sweeping that series, but instead the Tigers take 2 of 3. I know the Royals give you some PTSD because of the ALCS. So go Twins, I guess. I don't know, but I would be surprised if the Twins make it up to that second best wildcard team. I think it's more than likely either the Tigers or the Royals. I think I would probably rather see the Tigers just because on paper, I think the Royals are a better baseball team, but man, you don't want to see the hottest team in baseball in the first round of the playoffs.
It's also so interesting because the Royals at one point were an extremely hot team, and then all of a sudden...
They were them, yeah.
Yeah, they've swapped places almost.
Right.
Where they just snapped a 7-game losing streak with the Nationals last night. They could have been that other game where if the Twins won, then the Orioles would have needed the Royals to win last night in order to clinch a playoff berth. But it's very interesting to look at the Royals and still be confident that you can sweep them in a wild card series just because of the history that they've had in the second half, regardless of this 7-game losing streak that wasn't too long ago.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. It is really hard to take on a team that is hot right now, and that is the Tigers. I mean, they just won the series against the Orioles, not right before this one against the Yankees. So and at that point, you do know the team that you're playing more familiar with if you do take on the Tigers back at home. So we'll see. I think I would probably, I don't know, I'd kind of pick the Royals over the Tigers.
It's tough because the Tigers are really, really hot, and also you would have to see Tarek Skubal.
True.
Who's going to win American League Cy Young, which you really don't want to do, especially in a 3-game series. Corbin Burnes is Corbin Burnes, and if there is a handful of pitchers in baseball that I could look at and say, go out and beat Tarek Skubal, Corbin Burnes would be on the short list. He's probably one of the 5 pitchers in baseball that I could look at and say, go toe-to-toe with Tarek Skubal. I love Zach Eflin. Tarek Skubal's Tarek Skubal. So if there's any pitcher in baseball that can do it, that can put up whatever Tarek Skubal puts up in game 1 of a wild card series, it is Corbin Burnes. Man, I don't want to see Tarek Skubal in a wild card series, and that alone might sway me towards the Royals. The Royals have star power as well. They have Bobby Witt Jr., who, if Aaron Judge wasn't from another planet, is probably MVP 9 times out of 10. They've got Cole Reagans, who would probably start game 1 of a series as well. Really, really good lefty. Again, not quite Tarek Skubal, but he's got the strikeout numbers. He has the pedigree. That's a really, really good starter.
There's no easy answer.
No, that's the playoffs, right? But if you're the Royals or the Tigers and you're hosting their podcast, you're probably talking about, man, we really don't want to see Corbin Burnes in game 1 of a playoff series. And they've got a really good number 2 in Zach Eflin. And when you're looking at the Royals, okay, Seth Lugo has had a nice year. Brady Singer, Michael Wacha, those are all options for them. And for the Tigers, I don't know if there's a solid number 2 that I'm looking at after Tarek Skubal. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Tigers just kind of do what they've been doing, which is Tarek Skubal and then 4 bullpen games.
A one-man rotation.
After him. It's pretty much a one-man rotation because you're looking at Tarek Skubal and then, I don't know, you're going to throw Casey Mize game 2. You're going to throw Keider Montero game 2. So on paper, I still probably lean Tigers, but just Tarek Skubal alone makes me terrified of that team in a 1-game series. But thankfully, it's a 3-game series.
And I also think that having the upper hand right now for the Orioles is just knowing that you're 98% back to full health.
Yeah.
You're still missing Jorge Mateo. You're still missing Grayson Rodriguez for now. And of course, lots of other pitchers who have been dealt season-ending injuries. But from here on out, you have gotten Mountcastle back. You've gotten Westburg back. You've gotten Ramón Urías back. And those are 3 huge key pieces to this lineup offensively and defensively. And knowing that as these teams, if you're the Tigers or the Royals, you're definitely afraid of that on top of going up against a Corbin Burnes.
Yeah, and this is what the playoffs is, right? Yes, we're talking about the Tigers and Royals, and you've got to face Tarek Skubal and Cole Reagans. If we're talking about the ALDS, then, okay, you've got to go face Garrett Cole, or you've got to go face Framber Valdez or Hunter Brown, or you've got to go face Pablo Lopez. This is just what's going to happen when you're in the playoffs. And the Orioles having all of those guys back, I feel a lot better about their odds, even if it is Skubal on the mound game 1, even if it is Cole Reagans on the mound game 1. I feel a lot better with their odds with Corbin Burnes on the mound and their all-star third baseman back and their borderline all-star first baseman back and Ryan Mountcastle, who was right up there in voting, and Ramón Urías, who I can't wait for another Ramón reminder next week.
We should have had
when he has
today.
A nice week. I know the Ramón reminder was that
yesterday.
He's back and it's so exciting. So you feel a lot better about this team waking up on this Wednesday morning than we did last Wednesday morning when we were here. The playoffs are clinched. And
my bobblehead is good luck, by the way. I've decided that's why the vibes have changed.
Yeah, I mean, you can decide that if you want. I'll probably go with the fact that they got 5 really important players back, but you could also go with your bobblehead being the reason. Yeah.
We need a close-up of her. No, you don't want to see her close-up.
No, we don't need a close-up camera, I think.
But anywho.
That's going to get a veto from me. But, well, next time we're on this podcast, Annie, we're going to be doing a playoff preview. We're going to be back next week for...
Oh, that's pretty cool.
More than likely previewing game 1 of a wild card series.
October is almost here.
October's almost here.
Wild.
Yeah. The AL East is not yet clinched. It's probably going to be in a minute, but it's not yet clinched. So the next time you will see us, it'll be for a playoff preview. We're going to be breaking down game 1 of whatever series the Orioles are playing in, whatever team they end up facing. It's probably going to be Corbin Burnes on the mound. And with the guys that the Orioles have gotten back, it's probably going to be a pretty good lineup on the field. So thank you for sticking with us through our regular season coverage. Thank you for following along with us live on YouTube and Facebook. We are live every Wednesday at 11 a.m., or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on the Bird's Nest. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes. Next time you see us, we're going to be talking about playoff baseball here at Camden Yards, and we are so excited to bring it to you. For Andy Claff, I am Brandon Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.